Hi, I'm Damon Morelli. Time for another installment of the my Life and Learning series here. Today I've titled this presentation Views on Behavior from a Biological Perspective, and we will be looking at a lot of the information covered by Robert Sapolsky. I had the pleasure of watching his lecture series that he's posted online on YouTube. This is his behavioral biology course that he leads, and he's posted all of the lectures online. I really recommend watching him. He's also written the books Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers and The Trouble with Testosterone. The Trouble with Testosterone is a very easy read. I've not read the Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers yet. Robert Sapolsky covers such a broad area of knowledge that it's really impossible for me to develop some kind of presentation to go along with it. He covers such a wide range of fields, so he is looking at genetics, he is looking at biology, he is looking at our endocrine system, our hormones, he's looking at our nervous system, he's looking at social systems and cultural systems. He uses some network theory, complexity theory as well. It's a really, very broad approach that he takes, and yet at the same time, though, is that you really begin to appreciate how interconnected all of these different elements are when it comes to ideas such as behavior, and you really get to see really how connected we are in regards to our own behaviors, which we often like to characterize as, I have my own behaviors in my own life, and yet these are really very contextual, very dependent upon the context, behaviors of others, the situations that we're in, the time of the year that it is, wide variety of factors. We can really begin to see how our behaviors are very connected with the behaviors of others, just through some simple examples. When a male takes on an aggressive posture, there's a stress response, a hormonal response by other, maybe nearby males. A female walks in a certain way, bats her eyelashes at a male, there is a hormonal response by that male as well. So is that male determining his behavior, or is it a much more complicated affair? Some really interesting examples as to how kind of tied our behaviors are with each other comes. A great example is known as the Kavad syndrome, which is a sympathetic pregnancy. This is mentioned by Sapolsky. It looks like Dr. Arthur Brennan has done a bit of research into this as well. This is where a female will become pregnant, and the female's partner will exhibit characteristics normally associated with the early stages of pregnancy. Changes in eating habits, specific desires for certain types of foods, morning sickness. So again, is that the partner is not physically pregnant, and yet at the same time, though, takes on characteristics of pregnancy. Quite interesting. Another great, more measured example is that we have a hormone it's called prolactin, and prolactin is normally associated with female. It's a feminine hormone, and females have much higher levels of prolactin in their bloodstream, especially after giving birth, and that this prolactin is associated with motherly instincts, nurturing instincts. And Dr. Arthur Brennan has done these experiments where they take a blood sample, they measure the prolactin levels in a male's bloodstream, a new father, and then they will then bring the new father's baby into the room with the father and have the father hold the baby for 5 minutes, and they will then measure the father's prolactin levels again, and they find that the prolactin levels are highly elevated, more than double. And so again, is it that the father is nurturing the baby and that causes a rise in the prolactin levels, or is it that just the presence of the baby causes a rise in the prolactin level, which then causes the father to be very doting and very nurturing towards the baby as he's holding it? It's just, and again, it's not this happens and then this happens. It's this kind of ongoing dynamic, which is really, really interesting. There's some interesting research that shows how like body postures of other people will actually stimulate the production of certain hormones in other people, and so now we see how hormones affect behavior and how it's related to other people, and yet we also have our DNA that might be affecting our behavior, and yet Sapolsky really cautions against these kind of misguided understandings of how DNA affects a person's behavior, their cognitive position, etc. So the DNA is, of course, working at the same time in conjunction and in conjunction with the hormones and the nervous system and the environment and the other social behaviors among all these variables. And yet there's this kind of prevalent misunderstanding that DNA and particularly natural selection results in this only the strong survive kind of description of natural selection of DNA. And Sapolsky really, really cautions against this, because he gives some really great instances how DNA can in fact affect our behaviors, and yet often the way that the DNA affects our behaviors is often indirect. And there's he's done a lot of work on stress and stress hormones, and then also with social hierarchy and the way that social hierarchy plays into how susceptible a person may be to stress, and how this interplays with hormonal responses and again, nervous responses and things like that. A great example that he gives that is that in regards to turkeys, the animal turkeys, okay, and it's showing how indirectly genetics affects behavior. And again, we can draw kind of analogous parallels for human behavior. So turkeys have a very hierarchical society, and it's also turkey's position in society is also very heritable as well. You often inherit your position within the society, and so geneticists, believe that they had identified, the genetic, the gene that determines turkey's social position, and yet when we delve into it, what we find is that this gene actually is associated with the production of melatonin. or I'm sorry, melanin. Sorry, melanin. The amount of melanin in the production of melanin and how it in the feathers. And feathers, or turkeys that have this gene, produce more melanin, and their feathers are a bit more iridescent. And so because the feathers are more iridescent at a young age, the other turkeys, turkeys that have higher levels of melanin, are seen as being different from the other turkeys, and are thus then statistically more likely to be pecked at through this kind of aggressive pecking that occurs within their society, within their culture. And this then over time causes the turkeys with more iridescent feathers to take on, usually, statistically speaking, more submissive roles within the hierarchy. And so again, the genetics are playing a role in social position, are playing a role in behavior, and yet at the same time, though, is that it's absolutely dependent upon the other turkeys as well. So you can't remove the role of the genes out of the cultural, societal context, the social context. And this is really important to keep in mind, I think, especially when we get to education. Right? Hopefully you can kind of see maybe where I'm going with this, and the parallels and the ideas that we often bring these ridiculous ideas of intelligence and he has a good bloodline, right? Or he's from a good stock, or she's from a good stock, or something like that. And yet at the same time, though, we're also, when we say that, we're kind of decontextualizing it. We're taking it completely out of the context, and the context absolutely plays a role. This is a very dynamic process in regards to behavioral outcomes, performance outcomes within an educational environment. Is that it is genes absolutely play a role, and yet it's not as direct of a role as you may often think, that, oh, these genes make this person smart. It's a very simplified way of thinking about it. It's erroneous. So within this context here that we have, is that the assumption by behavioral biologists is that an organism kind of optimizes its behaviors, just given its context, given the conditions, in an effort to maintain genetic lineage. Okay, simply said is that as a way to maximize my reproduction within my context, within the conditions that I'm in, organisms optimize their behaviors. So perhaps for the turkey, taking on a submissive behavior, subservient behavior is perhaps maybe a way of optimizing its reproductive, as a kind of optimization strategy for maximizing its reproduction of its genes. And we find here that in optimizing, often cooperative strategies end up really allowing individuals to maximize their reproduction. And this is referred to as reciprocal altruism. And we find that reciprocal altruism can actually naturally evolve out of individual optimization behaviors. And so then these cooperative behaviors within groups can also then result in diversification and ultimately result in distinct competitive advantages over other groups. Okay, so this idea that only the strong survive, or strong leadership results in kind of some sort of success is again misleading. We find is that we have all of these individuals are working towards given the conditions, are working towards maximizing their reproduction, sexual reproduction, and that we actually do get with these strategies interacting with each other, we actually do get this kind of form of altruism and a form of cooperation, and that these groups that end up cooperating together actually end up outperforming the groups that are very kind of extreme hierarchical groups, or what Sapolsky would term these tournament species, or likely term these tournament species, in which the males are constantly battling for leadership positions and the right to sexually reproduce with a harem of females. And so here, again, my point here is that cooperation is actually a very natural outcome given our species, and the cooperative characteristics of our species has actually really allowed our species to thrive and reproduce. And given, obviously, we're very successful at that, right? 9 billion people on the planet. So I'm not here saying that these decisions are even rational, though. These are rational choices made logically, because these behaviors are influenced by a multitude of factors. For example, behaviors are affected by the male size to female size ratio of the species, by social status, by lunar cycles, by amygdala, which is a region of the brain, by the size of one's amygdala, by circadian rhythms, the availability of food, the sex ratio of the group, or of the social group that you are in. There are genetic influences, height, viruses, pain sensitivity, hormonal changes, the genetic predispositions of adoptive parents actually play a role in determining or play a role in affecting behavioral strategies. Culture, fetal and fetal environment, and this is just to name a few. So we have this really, really dynamic, complex, and we can't say, oh, that one thing is more important than anything else, because they all end up playing important roles in affecting behavior. And we need to just kind of keep this in mind, okay? And Sapolsky really tries to drive home that the factors that are influencing behavioral outcomes are not linear. He gives some good examples in regards to testosterone. His work is really related to the role of hormones in primate behavior, and he explains how testosterone can influence aggressive behavior, yet the behavioral outcomes are often quite conditional and involve inflection points. And what this means is that we might have at this level of testosterone, there is, let's say, this much aggressive behavior, okay, or maybe we'll say this much aggressive behavior. And if you have this much testosterone, then you get this much aggressive behavior. And yet at the same time, if you have, let's say, a very low level of testosterone, you then castrate a male, and you bring those testosterone levels essentially down to zero, is that the aggressive behaviors maybe return to or are slightly lower than where they were when the testosterone levels were here. So there's even this kind of residual effect. So you could see how we would expect if it was this kind of direct relationship, that you would have, testosterone levels here and aggressive behavior here, and when you raise it, this one raises, and when you raise it, this one raises, and when this one goes down, this one goes down. And yet again, it's really not that simple. Is that and he even shows how you'll have where you will increase testosterone and there will be no increase in aggressive, until some sort of inflection point, and then all of a sudden it jumps up. And then you'll go down again, and it won't, it'll stay up here until you reach some inflection point, and then it'll drop down to here. And then you will continue down all the way to 0, but it'll still stay here. I know that sounds a bit maybe counterintuitive, really confusing, but again, it's also showing that there are all these other factors going on as well at the same time. So just keep everything in context. So anyways, I really feel that a great deal of the ideas that he covered in his behavioral biology series and in his book, The Trouble with Testosterone, which is not related only to testosterone, but really falls under the umbrella, all of these ideas fall under the umbrella of behavioral biology, but they all have real strong implications for education. So some of the interesting research noted by Sapolsky that I think has direct lessons for education are just a few examples here. For example, stress and the production of the hormone hydrocortisone has negative effects on learning and memory. So we actually inhibit learning and memory function when we create stressful environments. Anytime that we elevate stress levels, elevated stress levels are associated with production of hydrocortisone, the hormone hydrocortisone, and research shows that inhibits learning and memory performance. For example, social position and its effect on stress and human health. And we know that health and stress play roles on learning and memory, and again, social position also plays this role that affects stress and human health. So again, we can see that these things are connected together. Emotions and moral decision making are affected by a great deal of context, whether this context is related to our nervous system, related to disease, related to hormones, to lunar cycles, etc. These things are very connected and probably need to be taken into consideration because they do actually have real effects, discernible, measurable effects. The effects of the physical environment on interpersonal relations is that we can actually find that the physical environment that students are in actually affects how they interact with each other. And again, we can extrapolate this into the classroom, how we structure the classroom environment, how even simple things such as how we arrange desks, and this is well validated, right? Does actually affect how we interact with each other, and those interactions, those social interactions, affect learning outcomes. I really hope that we kind of especially keep in mind this genetic versus the cultural elements of behavior. I really feel that the genetic elements are often very overemphasized and again decontextualized when often when people in academia are thinking about learning outcomes and learning performance and things like that. So just to try to summarize the theme that I took away from all of Sapolsky's lectures and his reading was that we try to understand all this background knowledge, and given this background, research requires a high degree of precision, yet I think Sapolsky cautions giving too much value to any one correlated behavioral relationship, especially in regards to genetics, which he firmly concludes is always contextual. Essential to his position is the understanding that learning is innate to all learning systems. However, what is learned is always conditional and always experiential. He advocates for really accumulating research data and then forming and later reforming somewhat overarching philosophical guidelines. And what I mean here is just that we do want to conduct research. We do want to identify correlations. And yet at the same time, though, it's also important, I think he's kind of saying, is it's also important to kind of trust our kind of intuitive judgment and continually reform our intuitive, judgment. Be open to modifications and changes, but that we conduct all this research, but when we find relationships and correlations, that we don't extrapolate those out too far. That we don't say, oh well, this is obviously the most important thing, is because all of these things are so important, and again, individual behaviors are very connected with other people's individual behaviors. And again, I think you can probably see where I'm going with that in regards to things such as grades and testing, hopefully. All right, so I know that this one is a little kind of vague. I know that this video is a little vague this time. Future videos will be a lot more specific. I'm just trying to cover a real broad swath of ideas in a very short time. Next time we'll be looking at Terence Deacon and his work on the kind of development of the brain, the evolution of the brain, and the evolution of language, and the way that they both kind of co-evolve. It's really, really interesting. So I hope that you take the time to watch that one next time. All right, I'm Damon. I'm out. Take care.